Welcome to Back to the Bible with pastor and Bible teacher Bryan Clark. Today, Bryan helps you discover the awesome responsibility you have as a steward in God's kingdom. Later, Arnie Cole and Kara Whitney will join Bryan in studio to break today's message down and help you move forward in faith. Now let's join Bryan Clark for today's study from the book of James, chapter 5.
Chapter 5, verse 1, "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries, which are coming upon you." What James is saying to these people who feel like they've become valuable and significant, people who have accumulated, he is saying to them, let's take a little trip into the future. If this description of you, there's three specific indictments that he's going to lay out. If these are true of you, your future is going to be a future of weeping and yowling. First indictment, verse 2, "Your riches have rotted, and your garments have become moth-eaten. Your gold and your silver have rusted, and their rust will be a witness against you, and will consume your flesh like fire. It is in the last days that you have stored up your treasure." First indictment would be stockpiling, storing up, hoarding what God has given you. Second indictment, "Behold, the pay of the laborers who mowed your field, and which has been withheld by you, cries out against you. And the outcry of those who did the harvesting has reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth." Second indictment is you have taken advantage of others for personal gain. In this case, he's talking about a farmer, landowner, who had the poor come in and do their harvesting, had the poor come in and work their fields. At the end of each day, the poor were paid, and it was typically the poor that did your field work. They didn't have a lot of money saved up. If they didn't get paid that day, they didn't eat that day. So at the end of each day, they'd get paid something, they'd go to the market, they'd buy some food. It was as simple as that. So here's a landowner who is hiring these people to work his fields, but he's not paying them. And in the ancient culture, the rich controlled the courts. There was literally no recourse for the poor. They simply went without. The core issue is this world operating system, this Scrooge system that understands less for you means more for me. If I don't pay you, that means I put more in my pocket. If you're a business owner, the formula is as simple as the more I pay you, the less I get. The less I pay you, the more I get. And so there's a decision that has to be made. Is this about me or is this about you? Is this about being selfish or is this about being generous? For us, the application would simply be as simple as the Scrooge system of the world is I take advantage of you in order to gain more for me. And is that really the system that I want to buy into? There's 100 different ways every week where we can process this system. Am I going to be someone who is defined by more for me, less for you? It could be money, it could be lots of ways. Or am I going to be defined by someone who's generous to you? Understanding that means less for me. It also has a clear message that we should pay our bills. The farmer who hired his workers should have paid the workers. This isn't complicated. In our culture, there are more and more ways today not to pay what you owe. And we have to be careful we don't get sucked into that in our culture. There's no integrity in that. We should pay our bills. That's part of our integrity. We don't because less for you means more for me. It's driven by the world's operating system. The text mentions that the cries of the poor are heard by the Lord Sabaoth. It's a really big name for God. It means the God of hosts, it means the general of the armies of heaven. This shows up over and over again in the New Testament, that at the end of the day, God will be the avenger of the poor. In every culture that's ever existed, the poor are abused. They're taken advantage of, and their cry goes out to God, and God's promise is someday, I will avenge the poor. I will come as the general. I will come with my armies. I will make things right. And so the text is saying, God hears that cry, and he's going to deal with it. And for those who have taken advantage of the poor for their own personal gain, God himself will make it right. Third indictment, verse 5, you have lived luxuriously on the earth and led a life of wanton pleasure. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and put to death the righteous man. He does not resist you. Now, there's nothing wrong with enjoying what you have. 1 Timothy 6 says that we should be thankful for what we have. We should enjoy what we have. We all have stuff. There's nothing wrong with that. That's part of God's goodness. But when our lifestyles are defined by this luxury and this wanton pleasure, that every moment of every day is about me, and I consume my resources upon myself. A lot of Christians would say, I go home and I do the budget. There's just not money left over for God. God would say, then change the budget. Just because you spend every penny you get doesn't mean you spend it rightly. Maybe you need to make some significant lifestyle changes in order to be more generous. This idea of consuming everything upon myself, he said, it's like a cow being fattened for the day of slaughter. You're setting yourself up for that day when you're going to weep and howl. And you're going to be miserable because you bought into a system that ultimately is going to let you down. And rather than using your time and your talent and your treasures for the things that matter, you've wasted it. And there will be a day of reckoning, a day of understanding that. Verse 6 is basically referring to the fact that when you don't pay the poor, when you don't reach out and meet the needs in the poor, in the first century with no social programs, these people simply died. Widows, orphans, poor. When people didn't reach out to them, they just starved to death. They just contracted diseases. They just died. And the text is saying this is just the equivalent of murder. You had the resource to help these people. They didn't do a thing to harm you, yet you were willing to live in luxury while the needs were all around you and these people died and you didn't even care. 3 simple indictments for the scrooges of this world. It's about stockpiling or hoarding in the most strategic time in history. It's about taking advantage of others for my own personal gain. And it's about consuming my resources on myself while there are so many needs around me that God would expect me to help meet. If that's the path of your life, then verse 1 describes where that path leads. There's going to be a day of weeping and howling and misery when you realize you have taken what God has given you and you have wasted it because you bought into the operating system of the world. Now, whenever the culture operates according to verses 1 through 6, and there's no question that's the operating system of the world, then there's going to be abuse. Then there's going to be victims. Then there's going to be people that are going to be wounded. That's where the next paragraph picks it up. Verse 7, therefore, in light of this, knowing it's true, be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. The farmer waits for the precious produce of the soil, being patient about it, and it gets the early and the late rains. You too be patient. Strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is near. The Greek word for patience here is a word that means self-restraint. In other words, it carries the idea that in this world of Scrooges, you are going to be cheated. You are going to be mistreated. You are going to be ripped off. And the tendency is to want to get even, to want to fight back, to fight fire with fire. And what the text is saying is don't do that. Don't get sucked into this system that will ultimately destroy you. So self-restraint, and he uses an illustration of a farmer as a picture of patience. Now you go back to an ancient world where they didn't have all this irrigation. They didn't have all these options we have. You simply planted and you trusted God for rain, and if God brought the spring rains and the fall rains, you'd get a harvest. If you didn't get a harvest, you probably would starve to death. So this was, for all the marbles. So these farmers were incredibly patient people. It carries the idea that we are patient not just so that we can bite the bullet and suck it up and get through it, but because the Lord is coming. That's why he uses the farmer. There is a harvest day. This isn't just suck it up, sorry, that's the way it is. He's saying God is coming back. Jesus is returning. The word for the return of Christ in this text is the word perusa, which is a word that was used to describe a king personally making a visit to a city. We're not just patient, we're patiently waiting. We do believe there will be a harvest day. We do believe there will be a day when things will be made right, where the wrongs will be made right, and God will come back and will usher in the new heaven and the new earth, everything that we've ever wanted. For now, we just have to be patient, and we have to endure.
You're listening to Back to the Bible. If you'd like to listen again, you'll find today's program along with older messages at backtothebible.org. And while you're there, browse our devotions, Bible studies, and Bible plans. You'll find a wide variety there, all designed to help you experience a deeper relationship with Jesus. That's at backtothebible.org. Visit today, backtothebible.org. Now let's return to our study in James chapter 5. Here again is Bryan Clark.
Verse 9, do not complain, brethren, against one another, so that you yourselves may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing right at the door. One of the dangers when you live in a world filled with scrooges is you can become scroogey yourself. If you get cheated enough, if you get mistreated enough, if you get taken advantage enough, there's an anger or a bitterness that begins to set into your heart. As a matter of fact, when he talks about do not complain, the Greek word is a reference not to external complaining, not verbal complaining, but internal. It's the idea that this is something I harbor in my heart. I think we'd use the word bitterness. That if I am taken advantage of enough, I start to get bitter. And what happens is that poisons my other relationships. Because the world mistreats me, that starts to poison my marriage. The world mistreats me, that starts to poison the relationship with my parents or with my children or with my friends or with my fellow believers. That's really the call here is don't let the scrooges of this world create bitterness that then poisons the rest of your relationships. And then he gives two illustrations of endurance and patience. Verse 10, as an example, brethren, of suffering and patience, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. We count those blessed who endured. You have heard of the endurance of Job and have seen the outcome of the Lord's dealings, that the Lord is full of compassion and is merciful. To a Jewish audience, they would have been very familiar with their heroes of the Old Testament, the prophets who endured great suffering for the cause, and Job, who endured so much, but in the end experienced the kindness and the compassion and the generosity of God. He's simply saying we too must be characterized by endurance, by perseverance, knowing that one day there's a harvest, knowing one day we will experience the goodness and the kindness and the generosity of God, knowing that day is coming. And by the way, he says the judge's hand is on the doorknob. It's getting really close. Then hang in there, do the right thing, and trust God to make it right. Verse 12 is a bit of a hinge verse between this week and next week. But above all, my brethren, do not swear either by heaven or earth or with any other oath, But your yes is to be yes and your no, no, so that you may not fall into judgment. Now, what he's not saying is that we should not take an oath in a court of law. When you stand before a preacher in a wedding, your vow is in essence an oath. When you sign a contract, that is in practical terms an oath. He's not saying any of those things are bad. He's referring to a practice in the first century that the religious leaders got very good at. Jesus addressed the exact same thing in the Sermon on the Mount. And that is, they figured out this crazy way to make oaths in order to make them more and less binding. As a matter of fact, they actually wrote down their formulas of exactly what that was. But basically, it sounded something like this. I promise you, I'm going to do an oath on my ear. And I'm going to promise you, and I'm going to do an oath on my belt. I promise you, I'm going to do an oath on my mustache. They had all these different ways to make an oath, and they were more and less binding. They did this so that if necessary, they could break their word. Someone would say, well, you promised. And I would say, well, I promised on my shoe. That's not a binding oath, and so it's okay to break it. And they would play those kind of integrity games. You'd have to imagine that people who were being mistreated, taken advantage of by the scrooges of the world, and maybe that's the system they were using. All these poor bring in the harvest, and the landowner says, well, I promised to pay you on an oath that I took on my shoelace, so it really doesn't count. So it's easy then to kind of get sucked into that and start doing the same thing. The grammar here would say this was a practice they were doing, and he's encouraging them to stop it. In essence, what he's saying is just let your yes be yes and your no be no. None of these games. We must operate with the highest degree of integrity. The heartbeat of this text is the fact that Jesus is coming again. The first time he came as a baby in a manger, the second time he's coming as a king and a judge. For now we understand that the operating system of this world is driven by the scrooges of this world. James is wanting to be very clear that we as believers should not get sucked into that value system, should not live our lives that way, should not be guilty of stockpiling and hoarding in the most strategic time in history. We should not be guilty of taking advantage of others so I can have more, should not be guilty of consuming our resources on ourselves while others in need go without. We shouldn't be sucked into this Scrooge-based system. But we also understand that he's coming back, therefore we can be patient. Therefore, like a farmer, we wait for the harvest. We know that day is coming. We're not just sucking it up and putting up with it, but rather we know that one day he will come. He will make it right. He will sort it out. He will expose the wrongs that have been done. The big question is, on that day, will you be numbered among those who celebrate his return, or those who will be characterized by weeping and howling and misery?
Now let's join Bible teacher Bryan Clark in the studio with author Kara Whitney and Back to the Bible CEO Arnie Cole.
Bryan, we might read James and say, I would never mistreat the poor or cheat in business dealings. So how does this apply to us today?
Yeah, so I think the point is whether we live a life of generosity or a life of selfishness. So one of the things I identified in this decade that we're in is I wanted to learn to be a more generous person with my time, my talent, with my money. And it's interesting, if you genuinely look for opportunity, all the ways we have to be generous. So it's a reminder, is this ultimately about me or is it about others? And what are the opportunities I have? But I also think, like in a business, I talk to my buddies that run businesses, and And we have these conversations. Just because something is legal doesn't mean it's right. You can justify a lot of abuse of people because it's legal. God's standard is, well, what would be generous? What would be benevolent? What would be in the best interest of other people? Not just whether this is technically legal or not. In what way is my business different? In what way is my life different in what I do with what I've been given from the others around me?
So, Bryan, it's pretty common, at least I know in my experience, to be ripped off business-wise or even in personal situations. So how are we supposed to remain patient and give grace and mercy during these times? Doesn't that just open us up to being ripped off again?
Yeah, I suppose it could. I think we need to be wise. We need to learn. We need to be skillful. The Bible doesn't call us to be naive or foolish. So some of that's a stewardship issue of being a good steward of what I have. But I also recognize in a very selfish culture that people are going to seek to take advantage, and at times I may be ripped off. And I think what James is saying is don't let that cause you to become angry and bitter, and you become a Scrooge too, which is a challenge in a selfish culture. But sometimes I think just for the sake of our witness, it's best just to eat it and let it go. People pretty much know me as a pastor, and I can't tell you how many times things have happened where I just choose to eat it and let it go, because maybe next week they come walking through the doors of the church, and I don't want them seeing a guy they had a bunch of conflict with. And so for the sake of the kingdom, sometimes it's best to just let it go and move on.
We talked about this in your last series, but if we know and truly believe that Jesus is coming again, that should change how we live life now.
Absolutely. So churches argue a lot about end times theology, but we all agree together Jesus is coming back, and that should matter. And I should live in light of the return of Christ every single day. So there's a sense of readiness, there's a sense of urgency. If Jesus came back today, what would matter? And that should create a certain perspective that helps me. And there's great joy in that.
Thanks for taking time to be with us today. If you'd like to listen to this message again, please visit us at backtothebible.org. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more of Bryan Clark's teaching, right here on Back to the Bible. To listen again or find out more about our speakers, come to backtothebible.org.